You worked as a lifelong professor in the departments of systems biology and medicine at Harvard, and as the director of cancer research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. You returned to Harvard's medical school after a short hiatus, where you and a lab of postdoctorates discovered a previously unknown enzyme in the human body which provided a signaling pathway key to understanding cancer cells. The discovery of the PI3 kinase enzyme is being used to develop treatments for various forms of cancer, and it had led you to receive the Jacobius Prize by the Novo Nordisk Foundation at the Karolinska Institute in Norway. Your work has been featured on national programming, including 60 Minutes. You are the co-author of Aegeus Pharmaceuticals, a member of the advisory board of AVEO Pharmaceuticals, and a member of the advisory board of the Transmolecular Incorporated. In recognition of your accomplishments and service, you were named one of 11 inaugural recipients of the Breakthrough Prize in Life Sciences. Your continued research has been recognized with many accolades, including the Ralph Luft Award of the Karolinska Institute, the Pescalar AACR International Award for Cancer Research, the Caledonian Prize from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Heinrich Wieland Prize for Lipid Research, and the ASBMB Advanti Award for Lipid Research. Your expertise in your field has led you to be elected to the National Academy of the Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Wow. Dr. Lewis C. Cantley, in recognition of your exceptional service and lifelong commitment to science and cancer research, by the power vested in me by the Board of Trustees, I hereby confer upon you West Virginia Wesleyan College's honorary degree, Doctor of Science, and cause you to be so hooded and to be presented with this diploma, presented on the 10th of May in the year 2014 in Buchanan, West Virginia. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Pam, and thank you, Alan, for the kind words and introduction. It's really great to be back at Wesleyan after all these years. I should say that the last time that I spoke at Wesleyan was the night before graduation, the night before commencement in 1971, 43 years ago. And I was quite nervous. I was not accustomed to giving public talks, and as I remember, the presentation I gave was pretty much a complete flop. And I think that's been confirmed by the fact that it wasn't until everyone had retired, including Alan Hamner, that they invited me to try this again. So with that in mind, in some trepidation, I will attempt to improve on my previous presentation. So the title of my presentation is How to Succeed in Life Without Really Trying. Now, hopefully, some of you have realized this is a paraphrase of a famous Broadway play from the 1960s called How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. At least your parents might remember that, and maybe even Alan Hamner would. But actually, this next generation, you guys should remember it too, because your friend, Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe from Harry Potter, revived this play on Broadway a few years ago, and my family were lucky enough to go there to see it. So it's still true today, it's still useful advice. And I'll paraphrase that in my talk. So I'll do this in the Letterman style. Originally I wanted to give, as in Letterman, the 10, starting with the least significant, moving to the most significant pieces of advice. But I was told I had under 2 hours. So I pared it down to 4. Now, some of these are rather specific to science, but as I understand, about half of you are scientists anyway. But I think even for those, you'll realize there's a broader implication that will be useful in life. So I'll start with number 4, the least significant of these pieces of advice. If you want to solve a really important problem, go work on something completely unrelated to it. Now, I won't explain these until I get to all 4, and then we'll go back and try to explain what I mean. The next one has to do with biology. So Newton's scientific method does not apply to biology or almost anything else you'll do in life. So try to forget everything you learned in science class in high school and college. Number 2, avoid choosing a difficult career and don't work too hard. And then finally, number 1, try to be the stupidest person in your group. So if you can accomplish those 4, I'll guarantee you'll be successful in life. So let me start with number 4 and give you what I actually mean by this. So if you want to solve a really important problem, go work on something unrelated to the problem. Now, the reason for this is that if the problem is really important and nobody has solved it, that means the direct and obvious approach is not going to work because probably some very smart people have failed to answer the question. So the best thing to do is take an orthogonal approach, clear your mind of the problem, and it may actually solve itself accidentally. So serendipity is our best friend in science, and I think in many other ways in life, backing away from a problem and realizing it was an important one, and when you accidentally solve it, just make sure you notice that you solved it. So I'll give a couple of examples, actually 3 examples. 2 from historically really important, and then a more minor one from my own career. Discovery of antibiotics. And I'm sure most people in the room know this story, but just to remind you, in 1928, Alexander Fleming was trying to grow bacteria in his laboratory. He was a rather poor scientist, not that he was a bad scientist, but he didn't have much money. And he probably was eating moldy bread, didn't have good scientific sterility in the lab, and some of the bread mold fell into the bacterial culture and killed all the bacteria. Now, any self-respecting scientist would throw out the experiment and start all over, but Fleming said, I wonder what was in that bread mold. And so he isolated the compound and he decided to call it penicillin. And that changed the world. Discovery of penicillin and later antibiotics has saved more lives than any other discovery in the history of mankind. But he didn't set out to discover penicillin. It was an accident. But he did notice that it was an important discovery. A second important one, discovery of inheritance and mechanism of evolution. Not trivial things to try to understand. In the mid-20th century, we knew nothing at all about how one cell inherited how to be identical to the parent cell, or how traits are inherited from parents to children. And so, how does the child inherit blue eyes from the parent? But there was some evidence by 1950. 49 was when I was born, I should say, that it was a molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, which more commonly known as DNA, that had something to do with it, but it was very mysterious. This was a long polymer of four molecules that sort of randomly integrated into polymer, and how could that possibly explain inheritance? Well, a physicist named Francis Crick, who knew nothing about biology and wasn't even working on this problem, ultimately ended up solving the problem. And the reason he solved it is because he was spurred on by a young 23-year-old scientist, PhD, just gotten his PhD, very young age, named James Watson. And Watson came to him and said, there's this X-ray diffraction of some crystal of this important molecule. Could you tell me what it means? And Watson, of course, as a physicist, knew how to interpret these X-ray diffraction patterns. And he looked at it and says, oh, it looks helical. And in fact, I think all of you have probably heard of DNA, the double helix. They discovered that that was the structure. It's more like taking 2 beads of pearls. I don't know if we see any pearls in the audience. We could ask for volunteers. You twist 2 pearl strings together, and they will ultimately coil into a double helical structure, much like a winding staircase. And so they discovered that structure and published a very brief paper in Nature in 1953 describing the structure. And it would just be a footnote in history. Isn't DNA a beautiful molecule? Except they made one interesting observation. As I said, there were 4 units to DNA called ATGC. We'll call them colors, yellow, blue, red, green. And what they noticed was that every time there was a blue bead on one strand, there was a yellow bead next to it on the other. And every time there was a red, there was a green. In other words, they always had fidelity in association. It wasn't random in how they associated. And so the last sentence of this very brief paper states it has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material. In other words, what they were saying was that if those two strands fell apart and each was used as a template to make another double helix, and you obeyed those pairing rules, then the next two you made were identical to the first one. And if you did that over and over again, you would expand with perfect copying of information. And that random sequence of red, blue, greens, yellow, what appeared to be random is not really random. It encodes all the information to build a cell or to build an organism. So this was, if you ask Watson or Crick, we can no longer ask, but Watson is still alive. Did they expect that the structure of DNA would explain inheritance? They clearly did not expect that discovery to occur. The fact that a physicist made the discovery rather than the important biologists who were dominating the field was also unexpected. I should add there were two other important things that came out of that discovery. It became also obvious that if there was an error, in other words, a blue combined with a green instead of a yellow, that would create a mutation that would be inherited by all future strands of DNA in daughter cells, and that's how you could explain evolution. So inheritance, evolution, and we now know even cancer is explained by errors in this mechanism. So very important observation came about somewhat by serendipity. By the way, I took no biology when I was at Wesleyan, nor did I take any biology or even biochemistry when I was at Cornell. And somehow the discoveries that you described, I think, would be unexpected to have come from someone who never took any biology. But I'll get back to that. Okay, advice number 2. The remaining 3 are very brief, so we're not really going to take an hour and a half. So advice number 2, avoid choosing a career that is difficult and don't work too hard. Now, there are a lot of parents in the audience, and they're kind of looking skeptical of me right now because I'm sure they all gave you advice as to here's the thing you should do for your career because it's stable, you'll always be unemployed, and you'll make enough money to survive. Now, the problem is that the world is changing very rapidly, we know. And so what is a very good career today may in fact be a lousy career 10 years from now and vice versa. So what you should really do is just follow your talent. What's really easy for you, you may find, is actually rather difficult for most other people when they try to do it. That's your talent. Follow that, and you'll probably find a way to make a living doing it. And what's more, because it's your talent, it's easy for you, you'll have enough spare time to have fun. And as long as you're having some fun, you won't burn out and abandon your career before you've had your impact. So that's what I mean by that. So in summary, if you have a talent, you enjoy practicing that talent, you'll make a living at it. Now, I'm reminded of a statement that Larry Bird made when he got a contract extension for the Boston Celtics back in the 80s. And what he said was, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "I can't believe they're paying me all this money to play basketball. I would do it for free, but I'll take the money." And you know, I feel that way about my career. What I'm doing, I feel like I would do for free. It's so much fun. But I'll take the money too. Unfortunately, I don't get paid as much as Larry Bird did. Okay, so the number 1 then here is try to be the most stupid person in your group. Now, what do I mean by that? Obviously, what I really mean is you should surround yourself by brilliant people. Now, for me, that was really easy because my parents were brilliant. They weren't particularly highly educated, but they were just naturally smart. And as were my brothers and sisters, as you saw recently introduced. And I remember when I was in the 2nd grade, and my sister Linda was in the 3rd grade, that there was a spelling bee in the school. I was still trying to learn to spell. My sister actually beat all the 6th graders in the spelling bee. And I was a bit intimidated by that. And in fact, because even today when I type on my computer, every 10th word has a squiggly mark underneath it, indicating it's not in the dictionary. And sometimes it's because they're words that I've kind of invented myself and through science, but usually it's just a misspelling of something. And if it weren't for Google, I would actually never get anything written. So for me, this was difficult, competing with my sister. What was worse, so our father would periodically have these little arithmetic oral tests, and we'd sit in the living room and he would say, what's 11 minus 4? And Larry would say 7. And Larry would always beat me, and he usually would even beat Linda. Larry's 3 years younger than I am. So that was also rather intimidating. I realized I wasn't particularly good at the things that you're supposed to be good at, spelling or arithmetic. And as I said, I could never give a speech either. That was so. But I was encouraged because along came Lloyd. And Lloyd was 8 years younger than I was, and I could beat him at everything. It was just the most pleasurable thing in my life for Lloyd to arrive. And so, spelling, arithmetic, name it all. I could beat him at all until he reached the age of 5. And after that, it was all downhill for me. Now, Lloyd went on to Wesleyan, graduated from Wesleyan, MD from West Virginia University, and ultimately found his way in Boston in the Harvard training hospitals. And at that time, I was on the faculty at Harvard. Actually, I was on the faculty at Tufts at that time. And so I invited Lloyd to come to my laboratory to learn some biochemistry techniques ostensibly. Actually, the reason I invited him is because I wanted to learn some biology and medicine from him because I'd never taken any courses in that area. And so I may have taught him a little bit, I doubt it, but I certainly learned a lot from him. So that's, you know, I should also say that Alan Hamner was of great advice to me as I was graduating from Wesleyan.